I'd like to thank Sarah for writing the book. That's the first thing. It is, and I'm sure most of you have read it. It is a wonderful book, and as timely, if not more so timely now than than collaboration innovation was in Edison's day. Basically, as you're aware, OR is about changing the way that we perceive and believe, or changing belief patterns around work and the way that we interact at work. And this is something which is a passion of both mine and Sarah's, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say over the next 4 weeks. So without further ado, I'll pass you across to Sarah.
Well, thanks so much, Mike. And it really is exciting to be part of the AWE Team.Read. There's so many people, so many experts within the body of membership of AWE that I'm really delighted to have a chance to interact with so many of you and get some comments and insights on Midnight Lunch and how collaboration can be part of our work today. As we think back to Thomas Edison and so many of his accomplishments, there's a great deal that we can learn and apply in the 21st century that Edison really mastered back in his time. So let's get started here. I'm going to offer a couple of thoughts about Edison and his life and work as we get into our conversation about collaboration. There really is so much that we didn't learn in school and so much that exists in the press, some of which is true and some of which is not so true, about Edison the man and Edison the scientist, as well as Edison the leader. So it's interesting to look at Edison even over a progression of his life. We see Edison here in the upper left as a young boy. And I don't know about you, but for me, I'm not one who often thinks of Edison as ever having been young. We look at the photo in the lower right here on the screen. That is really one of the most famous images of Edison, and in fact, it's the image that's on the front cover of Midnight Lunch. We often think of him as a person who is older and accomplished, but in fact, Edison had a 62-year career, and there's so much that he did during the different decades of his life. We'll talk a little bit about that today. But if we think of Edison's lifespan itself, it really is extraordinary to imagine that this man was born before the Civil War and died during the Great Depression. You can see by his birth dates here, 1847 to 1931. Really an extraordinary era of American history and something that we can really look back to with tremendous pride. A quick note about my family. I learned that I was related to Edison when I was about 6 years old. This gentleman that you see in the lower left, Louis Miller, is my great-great-grandfather. He was an inventor in his own right. He had 92 patents and 11 children. So he was a very busy guy and extraordinarily accomplished. This woman that you see here in the center frame, Mina Miller, was his 7th child, and she married Thomas Edison in 1886. When she was 20 and he was 39. Edison's first wife actually passed away, leaving Edison with 3 children, ages 14, 12, and 10. So Edison was 39 when she married him, and she went on to have 3 more children with Edison, so he had 6 children by the time he passed away during the Great Depression. This gentleman you see in the upper right is my grandfather, Robert Anderson Miller, and he invented shatterproof glass at Pittsburgh Plate Glass. So I grew up with stories of innovators and inventors and hearing about the challenges of what it took to be innovative over a long period of time, the kind of persistence and courage and creativity that is required for that. I always remembered the stories of Edison that I heard when I was growing up, and they really intrigued me. And I think my career in marketing at the Quaker Oats Company and Helene Curtis, which is where I spent the first 15 years of my corporate career, really was an outgrowth of my understanding of Edison himself. Understanding how to develop new products, what it took to motivate people, how you bring a team together to innovate and collaborate were things that always fascinated me. I've had a chance to visit all of Edison's laboratories And the one that you see here is actually Edison's Botanic Laboratory in Fort Myers, Florida. And we're going to talk today about the workspaces that Edison had and how they were so extraordinary and unique in generating collaboration. This gives you just a bit of a flavor for it. There are two other existing laboratories of Edison's, one that was at Menlo Park. This is the one we hear most about, Menlo Park, New Jersey. That laboratory was actually moved to Dearborn, Michigan. So some of you may have visited it if you've been in the Detroit area. It's now at the Henry Ford, huge campus there just outside of Detroit. And as well, the West Orange Laboratory, which is in West Orange, New Jersey. So we'll talk about those resources, but these are visual reminders of Edison's work as a scientist and an inventor today. A lot of my research has been done using original materials. I have worked with the staff at the Edison Papers Archives at Rutgers University, which is an extraordinary group of people that are Edison experts and have really dedicated their life to studying Edison and understanding all of the materials that he generated during his lifetime. And there are literally millions of pages of his work. These are notebooks, patent documents, personal correspondence, business correspondence, court testimonies. All of these are ways that we can examine how Edison was thinking during various facets of his career and his inventing activity. So if we think about Edison in our mind's eye, just imagine your most common impressions of Edison. Many of us, and I write about this in Midnight Lunch, many of us think of Edison as working alone, as a guy who was kind of burning the midnight oil. He was in a laboratory somewhere or maybe a basement of his house. Some people imagine him in a garage. But regardless of where you think about him, one of his most extraordinary qualities was his ability to generate robust ideas. And I think this is part of the power that we can draw forward to our thinking as 21st century leaders and executives, is this notion of generating robust ideas. But part of what Edison did was to actually go beyond that. He didn't just stop with the ideas. He wanted to apply them. He wanted to make his ideas practical. Sometimes we miss this part in our efforts. In looking at innovation and collaboration, we aren't thinking about what are the needs that we're seeking to serve. Edison was very keen on generating utility. And you can see this word here in the slide. I don't want to invent anything that won't sell. I don't want to invent. Its sale is proof of utility, and utility is success. So if we think about this man, who is actually the father of research and development, the Menlo Park Laboratory was actually the world's first research and development facility. Edison was not only interested in the ideas, but how to apply them. So this is a very important part of our conversation about collaboration and what is really the outcome of collaboration. In Edison's time, he pioneered 6 industries. This is probably one of the most extraordinary findings, if you will, that I came upon in my research. I really had no idea that there was such a prolific array of industries that Edison spearheaded during his lifetime. And part of what we see here as extraordinary is the range of time. If we look to document duplication, which he pioneered in 1873, and I have some interesting stories about that in Midnight Lunch, we can travel all the way through to his invention of the storage battery in 1903. So this is a 30-year window of time. And expanding and exploring these 6 industries in just 30 years, to me, is astonishing. If we think about Wayne Huizenga, just as one name to put out there, Wayne Huizenga established 3 Fortune 500 companies in the course of his career. And that has never been accomplished before. So we think of the billions of dollars of market value that's involved here. And in fact, by 1910, Edison had generated, through his patents and the development of these industries, $6.7 billion in market value. So we really can see the utility. We really can see that there was practical outcomes to Edison's collaborative work with his teams. And if we bring that $1910 figure to today's dollars, we see that the value actually exceeds $100 billion. So there's a great deal that we can learn from Edison as we look at our global business environment today. Edison actually established over 200 companies in his lifetime. He had operations in Europe and as well in North America. This is something we don't often think of Edison as achieving, but he was really a global thinker. So as we look to a global environment, we can really gain insight and gain understanding from Edison because he was also thinking very broadly in his era. So looking at changes in the global environment is something that we'll do today. Understanding why collaboration is so crucial. I'll give you a quick flavor of what a midnight lunch actually is and how it's relevant to collaboration. And then we'll spend a chunk of time talking about workspaces and what Edison did to actually nourish collegiality in these workspaces. A couple of thoughts about what has shifted in the global playing field. I had a chance to hear Dr. C.K. Prahalad deliver an extraordinary address at the World Innovation Forum in 2009. And I talk a little bit about this in Chapter 2 of Midnight Lunch. C.K. was describing the merging of strategy, innovation, and value creation. This is really something we have never seen before. Coming out of the Great Recession, there has been so many changes to how we do business, the way we think about developing products and services. We now have an ability as organizations to create with our customers and employees. This is something that we didn't focus on quite as much because finances have become more of an issue. Prahalad has told in his pronouncements that he really thinks the area of collaboration will be crucial to this blending of strategy, innovation, and value creation. And he talks specifically about the need to look forward, to anticipate and create, rather than just sensing and responding. And as we think about collaboration, this is what we really want it to help us do. We want collaboration to help us look forward. And in a moment, I'll talk about how Edison did that. But if we look at what leaders want to be thinking about with relationship to collaboration, part of it is relevance, staying relevant. Yes, we want to be profitable and growing, but relevance, according to Rashad Tubakawala, who is one of the extraordinary leaders I had a chance to interview for Midnight Lunch, he talks about staying relevant, innovating, and attracting and retaining talent as the top 3 things that leaders need to be thinking about today. And what he believed, just as Prahalad did, was that collaboration and strength around collaboration is essential to excellence in all 3 of those areas. So we have those thoughts to keep in mind, but we also have elements of workforce engagement to keep in mind. And this is, again, where collaboration becomes very relevant. We see some of the statistics around demographics that are quite stunning. 1 billion working-age adults coming into the global workforce between 2010 and 2020. And I talk about this at some length in the 2nd chapter of Midnight Lunch. We see the proliferation globally of mobile phones, with over 5 billion mobile phones active at the present time on a planet of 7 billion people. So this notion of being connected and staying connected is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. And we've got to understand how collaboration can be navigated in that environment, especially since we see that virtual teams are becoming increasingly popular. Forrester Consulting estimates that 40% of, this is U.S. companies specifically, now operate with some form of virtual team in place, and that number will rise to over 50% in just a few years. So this is extremely important for us to understand, what are the skill sets that we need to collaborate effectively? How can we think about the digital age given this proliferation of smart devices? What are the kinds of resources that we should be looking at to bring into our workplace? What are some of the things we need to keep in mind as we hire people to come into this very connected and collaborative environment? So these are the questions that I wanted to address in Midnight Lunch. I had an opportunity to release a book with Michael Gelb, my co-author, in 2007 of a book called Innovate Like Edison. And in that book, I looked at sort of the whole playing field of Edison's innovation process. But in Midnight Lunch, I delve more deeply into the collaboration aspect of Edison's work, which I began addressing in the first book. But Midnight Lunch really offers a deeper dive. And you can see a couple write-ups about the book. There was a great write-up in the December-January edition of Fast Company. There's a link there if you'd like to have a look. But it's been very favorably received, and I'm so thrilled to have a chance to go into some of these components in more depth with you today and get some of your feedback on the first phase, which is what I call the capacity phase of collaboration. And this really looks at how do we nourish collaboration? How do we even get started with this important area of competitiveness? Next week, we'll talk about context, which is part of phase 2, and how we begin dialogue around collaboration. That will be on April 19th, which is next Friday. And then we'll have a conversation about phase 3, the coherence phase, on April 26th. And we'll talk about microcultures and as well ways the teams can stay together over the long term. And finally, we'll wrap up with a dialogue about complexity, which is a huge issue facing us today in the workforce and in the way we navigate our workplaces. That will be on May 9th. So I hope that you'll be part of those discussions as well. If we look at how Edison actually defined collaboration, it's a very unique definition, and it's not one that I've ever seen mirrored or imitated anywhere else. What Edison really did was to embrace the notion that collaboration was not really a series of tasks. It was this creating solutions from the first moment. It's about actually allowing solutions to emerge over a period of time. You can see from this definition as well that Edison recognized collaboration was complex. He didn't try to dumb it down. He didn't try to oversimplify it. And you'll see in just a moment why complexity is something that we need to recognize right from the beginning of our collaboration efforts. One final thought, and we'll get into this in more depth in phase 3 and phase 4. That's the notion of creating a common goal and a shared purpose around the collaboration itself. It isn't just enough to be working side by side and solving a problem. You really have to have buy-in on what you're doing jointly. What is the common goal that you're laboring toward? This is not something that's always immediately obvious from the beginning of a collaborative effort. One other final quick note before we get into the meat of phase 1, and that is just to call to your attention some of the differences between collaboration and teamwork itself. I think this is where we can get a bit hung up. We often define teamwork as a very, I'll call it narrow function. And you can see this framework noted by Greg Cox, this quote here. He's the president of the Dale Carnegie Training Office here in Chicago, which is where I'm based. This particular office is the 3rd largest in the world. So Greg has an opportunity to work with employees and leaders who are part of Fortune 500 companies, as well as mom and pop organizations and mid-sized companies. And what he says is very apt. Collaboration is not the same thing as teamwork. Teamwork is simply doing your part. Collaboration involves leveraging the power of every individual to bring out each other's strengths and differences. So here's where we see a difference in the task orientation. It isn't just about checking into your team, doing your part, and checking out. that can often lead to a task orientation, which is not part of discovery learning. So what we see in phase 1 capacity is really the starting point for beginning this notion of how do we create that connection? How do we create the discovery learning aspect of collaboration? What do we do to address complexity? Looking here at what Thomas Edison achieved so successfully, we can see that Edison began his collaborations with small teams. This is one of the things that in my own experience of corporate life, and I'll be very interested to hear from some of the attendees on this as well, how do you actually get traction quickly with collaboration? And part of it is this small, nimble grouping of people. Many times we start with 15 or 20 people on a team. And Edison didn't believe that was the best way to approach it. He wanted communication to be nimble. He wanted people to be able to meet in just one room together. So he held his teams to sizes of 2 to 8. And if he needed more resources as time went on, then he would stitch these teams together. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But think about your own teams and your own experience of large versus small teams. One of the other things that Edison insisted on was that there be common experiences that these teams shared. And this is where the midnight lunch part comes into play. And if you've had a chance to get through into phase 1 in the book, I talk about what a midnight lunch actually is. A midnight lunch was a practice within the lab at Menlo Park and West Orange when Edison would return to the lab after the end of the workday and check in on his experiments. And he'd spend some 2 hours looking at his experiments, but also walking around and talking to others who were also staying late and seeing what their experiments, how they were faring, talking with them, troubleshooting with them, and ensuring that people were sharing their experiences about their experiments, even if these folks had expertise in differing areas. So what this involved was a commonality of language. It became a way to share insights. It became a way to recognize different work styles and, very importantly, to practice taking risks together. So in these forums where they would work for a few hours, Edison would have lunch ordered in for everyone, or what they came to call midnight lunch. This was food and beverages, sandwiches from a local tavern. They'd tell stories, sing songs for about an hour, and then they'd go back to work. So this is part of really a ritual. It was kind of an employee ritual that was unique to Edison's lab that came to reduce what today we would call the social distance between the employees. Rather than thinking of people by their title or their tenure or how much money they made and using that as the defining parameter for that person, reducing social distance in Edison's lab meant that people looked at each other as colleagues. So this process in phase 1 involved a transformation from being an employee to being a colleague. Part of what happened in this transformation was an ability to generate trust and create deep exchanges through these sharing of insights, transferring notebooks from one person to another, actually watching experiments take place, and then eating and kicking back. So a very unique way of addressing collaboration and bringing people together to form a common bond very early in their experience. Part of what I urge you to do is look in the book at some of the comments I make about the book by Anne Donelon called Team Talk. There's some very specific comments about the types of language that happen in a collaborative setting. Greater use of the words we and us and our. This is part of how casual exchanges happen, rather than focusing on words that involve I or me or mine. When we see this kind of communication happening, we are encouraged to share our private information. We're encouraged to bring our best stuff to the table and not keep it private or to ourselves. We bring it out for the team, for the forum, to actually work with and adopt as part of their collaboration. One key point here before we continue on to the next facet of our conversation, which is about the workspaces themselves, is that the phase one component of collaboration involves looking at questions. This leads us also into parts of phase two and the development of context. But one of the distinguishing criterion of collaboration, as you saw from the definition, was the notion of discovery learning. And the focus that Edison had on generating questions at the beginning of his collaborations very much distinguishes it from other ways of working. In the sessions that I do with executives and some of the consulting work that I do with organizations, what I find is that we're rusty. We're rusty at asking questions. So using this technique that Edison engaged in phase one of his collaborative process, generating collaboration capacity, allows us to kind of break through the rust of some of these skills that we haven't exercised for a while. Similarly, and we'll talk about this next week, is the idea of creating hypotheses. What do we think could happen? Not only are we going to ask questions, but we're going to look out into the future and create possibilities. When we think about Edison pioneering 6 industries in roughly 30 years, part of his success with this came with his ability to create hypotheses about what was possible and work forward not incrementally, but from keeping a future state in mind. So we'll go through some of that in our next conversation. But this is part of what was prompted by his workplaces, this notion of generating learning cycles for his employees through the questioning and the development of hypotheses allowed him and his teams to work rapidly. This is part of what we're seeking today. How can we get people to be more agile, to think nimbly, to be on their game throughout the workday? Part of what we also want to have them do is get into this mode of anticipating and creating and not just sensing and responding. So we see Edison encouraging these behaviors not only through some of the practices that I've described, but also through his workspaces, places where people could gather, ways that people could connect that were different and unique. One of the things I talk about in Midnight Lunch, and I put the page numbers here, and I know the folks who have e-book versions of Midnight Lunch can find this. I think I'll get the exact chapter for you in a moment. But this is an area where I talk about the way we look at the workspace now, or have traditionally looked at the workspace for the last 10 or 20 years. We're really coming out of the industrial age and an industrialized view of how people worked most efficiently. And many of you have probably worked in an environment that had cubicles where there were very neat rows and desks that were aligned in a very particular fashion. And you could kind of easily navigate the workspace from one area to another. But it wasn't so easy to connect. It wasn't as easy to meet as a team. So part of what Edison wanted to do was to sort of break that tethering idea. He wanted to think about the workspace as a place where ideas were happening all the time. So he reconfigured his physical environment and did this intentionally to create spaces for individuals to work, spaces for small teams to work, and as well spaces for larger groups of people to work in real time using a very tactile, hands-on connection. I wanted to show you a couple of Edison's workspaces, and I'd really be interested to hear from some of you as we open this up to questions and answers on some of what you see in play here in Edison's workspace and what strikes you about it. This particular shot is taken from the Menlo Park Laboratory. It's taken from the second floor. This is the entire second floor here. And this is actually the restored version of the laboratory. I mentioned that the Menlo Park Lab was moved from Menlo Park, New Jersey to Dearborn, Michigan. Henry Ford did that in 1928 in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of the invention of the incandescent electric light in 1929. So what you see here is a very kind of neatened up version, if you will, of the Menlo Park Labs workspace. But you see the jars and vials of chemicals on the side. You see individual tables where people could work individually. You see in the back there, that's actually a pipe organ. And they used the pipe organ during midnight lunch to sing songs. And it was a really interesting way that they spent their time. Sometimes they made music and did all kinds of crazy things with music during their kickback sessions and their social conversation. So this is a very interesting layout, I think, for a workspace in the 1880s. This is the actual campus structure of the Menlo Park Laboratory itself. That long building that you see toward the foreground, that is what you just saw, the second story of that particular building. The other buildings there had various functions. In the back, you see another rectangular structure. That was actually the machine shop, as it was called, and that's what this looks like. This is, again, the Menlo Park facility that was moved to Dearborn. A couple of folks walking through in this picture that I took. But you can see this is a place where things were actually being made. This is where prototypes were constructed. People could talk and work with each other in this space. There's actually even more space behind me. This picture doesn't capture all of it, but you get an idea that it was very tactile and a place where things could actually be developed and designed. If we think about the West Orange Laboratory and look at that campus, you can see it's quite different in its feeling. Taller buildings, larger space. The building in the foreground is a 3-story laboratory. It was much larger than the one that you just saw at Menlo Park. It had specialized rooms. It also housed a library, which I'll show you in just a moment. There was an area where the first movie studio was constructed on this campus. It was about 15 acres in size. So a very different feeling here. The West Orange Laboratory was the world's first industrial research lab, and this is where Edison not only conducted research, but also manufacturing. So we see a very interesting integration, once again, of workspaces around manufacturing. I don't have any to show you today, but you can see how close the manufacturing space was to the laboratory. It was literally just a few yards away. So if we think about what types of collaboration were possible at the West Orange Lab, here was a space where Edison encouraged solitude. This was his library. His desk was actually in this space as well. People could come here and do research very quietly and work on their own. They also had quiet, separate spaces within the larger laboratory. These were individual rooms where they could set up chemicals or small equipment, any kind of thing they wanted to work on. You can see there's a little desk there, and someone's placed a notebook in here for this particular shot. So people could work on their own as well as bring teams into a room like this, and Edison often undertook that. I talk about that in Midnight Lunch. This is a group workspace at the West Orange Laboratory. Here you can see there's a lot of equipment available, but sort of little bays or aisles where people can step in and do some of their own individual projects and yet feel that they are part of a larger effort, a collaboration process that engages many people. So I think this is a very interesting variety of workspaces, ways that Edison was seeking to allow individuals to work on their own, small teams to work together, and as well larger groups of people to be working on multiple efforts at the same time. So this is a big part of what is important for collaboration. It's important to actually encourage, through the use of workspaces, the types of activity and behavior that Edison wanted his collaborations to model. He wanted these small, diverse teams to have places to go, to connect, and have dialogue. He wanted people to feel a sense of togetherness and work as colleagues in these spaces. He encouraged dialogue and hands-on engagement through the development of prototypes and various types of experimentation that led to this discovery learning process that I was talking about earlier, and as well led to very practical applications of the outcomes that emerged from these conversations. So workspace was hugely important in all of this. And I'd really like to open up the conversation now to our chat function. And Mike, I'd love it if you could come back on the line here and we can have some dialogue about what some of these workspaces, how they connect to some of what we see today, and as well how they're different. What are the things that we notice, obviously beyond technology, that have shifted in today's workplace, and how is collaboration encouraged or perhaps not encouraged for some of the spaces that, that we see?
Hi, Sarah. Yeah, thank you very much for that. That was incredible. What a great presentation. What a great webinar. Let's open this up to the floor. I know that many of you have been anticipating this first webinar greatly, and I know that a number of you will have questions around this. So let's fire open the chat and let's get the debate going.
I'm going to flash back through some of these slides, Mike, too, just so that we can have some of these on the screen as we talk. I know that there are many folks within AWE that have different areas of expertise around workplace design. And this is an area that I've really just started learning about as part of my research for Midnight Lunch. And it's extraordinary when we think about many of the companies that design equipment to be used in workspaces. I mean, these are actual desks and cubes and mechanisms for filing, ways to encourage people to engage in dialogue. You know, we see Steelcase doing this, Herman Miller, many other organizations that dedicate their employees to understanding these processes. Mike, have you ever had a chance to get to any of Edison's labs?
No.
I know you're in, I wonder if you've ever gotten down to the Dearborn or the Detroit area.
It's actually fairly close from Toronto, and we do go down to Michigan on a number of occasions, and I've never been there. Next time I do go, I'm definitely going to go there. The one that struck me, I looked at it when you put the slide up, was Menlo Park. You know, if you take the chemicals away and the vials away and you know, the scientific equipment away, it looks like a Google office. That is, you know, the pictures that you see nowadays of the Google office, and how that, I don't know whether they modeled any of that on Edison's laboratories, but it just struck me that looked exactly the same.
Well, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because I think that you know, what we see is a very interesting parallel to the notion of sort of, how can I describe it, customizing your workspace and making it personal. And so that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about some of this. And maybe that's part of what you're reflecting on here. The other thing that strikes me is that, you know, there's ways of navigating easily at Google. People can move easily from area to area. I think that's something that's certainly in common with what you see at the Menlo Park facility. I'm just looking at one question here from Terry. She's asking, do you think Edison's approach to collaboration can be done in today's work world, which is increasingly global, when team members are on different continents and in different time zones? And I just, you know, want to react a bit to that, and I think it's an excellent question. I talked a little bit about, you know, virtual teams and the fact that virtual teams are really becoming an integral part of how we operate. I talk in the first chapter, and I believe the second chapter as well, about time zones, and when you get beyond, you know, 4 time zones, it really is very difficult to engage in collaboration readily. What virtual teams need to do is ensure that they have opportunities over the course of their project work to meet one-on-one. It's possible to sustain virtual teams over a long period of time as long as those check-in windows occur. It really is so tough when you don't have a chance to roll up your sleeves and work side by side. This is where some of that invisible bonding happens. This is kind of like the midnight lunch analogy. It's very important that leaders who have control of things like budgets and air travel and allowing people to connect at various points during a fiscal year, that they consciously allow people the latitude to do this and very strategically plan for it. So it's an excellent question. Telepresence gives us a hand. Telepresence has come a long way since its earlier times, but it doesn't always give us the ability to create some of those bonds that are so crucial. A couple of other questions here. One comment from Andrew Norris. Hi, Andrew. Great to have you on the call. He's commenting that he likes the quiet areas. Some people have different work styles and aren't always into constantly connecting and collaborating with people, and that's definitely true. Edison was very cognizant of this, and in fact I write in my first book, Innovate Like Edison, and also in phase 2 of Midnight Lunch about the notion of working alone. Edison felt it was very important to have a successful collaboration, that people learn to work on their own, generate insights on their own, and then be prepared to share those. So this back and forth process, if you will, between working solo and then working as a group for Edison was a defining part of collaboration. So yeah, quiet areas are very, very important. And just a note here, and I apologize I didn't mention this at the start of the broadcast. The webinar is being recorded today, and all of you will have a chance to have access to the recording. I will also put up on SlideShare a summary of the slides so that for those of you who might be just listening to the call on the phone, I know there were a few people who could only dial in today and can't see the slides, you'll have a chance to catch up with those. And again, I'll send out the link via AW, and Mike, you and I can just be sure that everybody has that.
Absolutely, Sarah.
Another question here from Christine. Anthropological research shows that teams of about 6 people will form non-hierarchical bonds. And she's just commenting that Edison's teams of 2 to 8 people really kind of hits that sweet spot. And Christine, you're absolutely right. There's been a lot of research, some of it conducted up by some professors at the Kellogg School of Business, which is at Northwestern University, and certainly many others as well, about sort of the management science aspect of all this. Many studies have been done to look at troubleshooting. Troubleshooting is actually very effective in teams of 8 people or less. And that's another part of this non-hierarchical component that you're talking about. Other studies that I'm familiar with talk about the ability to take risk. And when you're in a smaller team, you just have that desire or willingness to ask questions and take risks that kind of shrink away when the team gets too big. So I think that links in with your point about the non-hierarchical bonds that are created. So thanks so much for bringing that up. One other quick question here. Let's see. I'm trying to expand my little box here so that I can see it. There's a question about, how do you make decisions when people disagree? Wow, this is great. Some of this we'll talk about next week in more depth. Phase 2, which is the context phase, as you get into the questions and the hypotheses, start doing some actual experiments and prototyping, there definitely are different points of view that come into play. And part of what's powerful about collaboration is that debate is actually encouraged. And I like to say constructive debate when I talk about this, because what we're not looking for is kind of the ripping others to shreds and making other people feel like their ideas are invalid or won't be heard. So constructive debate and constructive dialogue is very important kind of as a baseline here. When it comes to decision making, there's a great quote from one of the gentlemen I had a chance to interview. His name is Vern Harnish. And you can look up some of Vern's quotes in the index if that makes things easier. I think all the ebooks have the indices as well. His last name is H-A-R-N like Nancy, I-S-H. He talks about the fact that collaboration is not democracy. And it isn't about the group voting on what to do. Part of what happens, and this comes through in phase 3, is that notion of the shared purpose, that notion of the aligned goals. And there will be people who will be assigned for decision-making in various capacities in some regard on many collaborations. Some people may have financial decision-making authority. Other people might actually have customer interaction authority. And some people may have authority with relationship to manufacturing or other areas of engagement. So often what happens is that decision-making capability rests within multiple people. So often the team has to decide as a unit, but if there is a need to decide outside the team or if this team gets stalemated, then typically someone beyond the team needs to step in. And I talk about this in phase 3. Sometimes it's important to find that champion or to know who the champion for your collaboration is so that that person can help the team troubleshoot and make decisions in very important circumstances, or find resources such as a coach or an outside executive who can help bring some objectivity to the conversation. So that is a great point. Decision making is not always easy.
Sarah.
Yes.
You know that I'm not going to remain quiet on this for too long. What are your thoughts on Yahoo, on the recent developments at Yahoo, and the whole notion of bringing everybody back into the corporate office to, and I quote, increase collaboration?
Yeah, and this is really a very interesting thing to be observing. I wrote a blog post about this, and it's on my website. If you go to powerpatterns.com and just find the blog tab there, you'll see my most recent post, which looks at what Marissa Mayer did. I think actually she was within her rights to do what she did. I think that it was a good move to bring people back into a live forum. Certainly it was disruptive to do that. It was abrupt as well, and I think that she loses some points perhaps for that. I do think that she would have generated more momentum around this decision if she had laid out a strategic vision for Yahoo prior. If she had even hinted at what this vision might be, I think that could have gone a long way to actually motivating people to go back into that face-to-face environment and work forward in a collaborative mode. What I think we'll probably see is that there's a lot of resentment that came around this decision and a lot of shifts in people's decision whether they're going to stay with Yahoo or not stay as a result of their inability to telecommute to their nearest office. So I hope that Marissa is going to be able to articulate that strategic vision and actually work with the employees to help shape it and create it. If she can do that, she'll be able to kind of form that collaboration capacity, which has been lacking at Yahoo. And I think this is one of the interesting things that you can read in the press. A lot of former Yahoo employees have weighed in and said, you know what, we really didn't have the greatest sense of collegiality within the company. People were kind of doing their own thing. There wasn't that fabric, that sense of integration and everybody pulling together. So she's going to have to work hard to recreate that, but also I think step in and generate some of that vision that will be so crucial for coherence as the collaboration environment expands.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. It's excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. I think the whole thing about that, everybody was missing, or at least the employees were missing the why component, and I agree with you 100% on that. I don't think the communication was really put out very well, and that's probably more to the point. I have one more question, actually, or let me not monopolize this. Have you any other questions that have been coming through on the chat?
Yeah, I just see one last one, next one, I should say, here from Christine with a comment about Silicon Valley companies that have started incorporated making areas, quote unquote. In other words, areas where people can engage in physical connection, whether it's through prototyping or some other type of activity. She talks about, even things like woodworking or fixing bikes or other types of hands-on connection. There's no question that Edison benefited from allowing his people to develop this aspect of their own work styles through hands-on engagement with experimentation, through the workspaces that you saw, the machine shop, etc. And I think this is a big part of what's been missing in our own work environments. And I'm just going to flip back over to this. I mean, this is kind of an extreme, granted, but there was a quote earlier from the book that is taken from Making Space, or Make Space, I believe it is, by two professors at the Stanford Design School, which is often called the D School. And they talk about this very thing, that you've got to be able to engage with your environment in a tactile way, not just in a mental or a visual way. So I think your point is right on, Christine, that workspaces today have to have some kind of tactile component. And Mike, you were just mentioning a minute ago about Google. There's definitely that tactile feeling that is part of their workspace. People bring their personal objects to the office. There are larger, structures, if you will, almost like sculptures that are interactive within the Google workspace that people can connect with and kind of interact with on a daily basis. So I think this is some of what we see. Facebook does the same thing. So I think it's a fascinating phenomenon.
Do we
I see a couple more comments here.
Great.
I'd also be interested in anybody who has perhaps watched a client design a workspace recently, or who has had input into the design of a workspace. I think part of what we're seeing, and a couple of you have commented on this, and this gets to Rashad Tabakawala's conversation about engagement and the ability to attract and retain talent today. Workspaces are part of that. The nature of the workspace, how modern it is, how connected it is, quote unquote, it is very important. We see a lot of the Silicon Valley structures, which have obviously grown up in more recent times, making these shifts. But some of what we also see, for example, here in Chicago, are vintage buildings that are recognizing the need to create different workspaces for attracting young workers. There's a very interesting group, and I'll just put this out into the chat if I can so that you guys can all see it. I think it's called Chicago Creative Space. And if you go on Twitter, it's I think it's #CCF. Oops. And you can check this out. I hope that I have captured this correctly. But this is actually a group that is broadcasting videos from different workspaces in Chicago and using this as a tool to position Chicago as a dynamic working city. I went to one of their events recently and saw one of the workspaces that they were featuring, but I think it's actually an interesting concept that cities themselves need to think about the workspaces that are part of their entire framework, their ability to attract executives at leadership levels, their ability to bring in young people. In one of the earlier slides, I talked about the Generation Y demographic being so crucial to the success of businesses for the next 10, 15 years. And it's essential that workspaces be part of that.
Yeah, I I totally agree with that. My background is talent management, so I've dealt a lot with retention issues with organizations, and the workspace is certainly an environment that is really important in terms of retention, and the physical environment, but also the emotional environment as well. One of the things I wanted to go back to was the optimum size for teams, Edison's optimum size for teams. That truly allows, in my view anyway, or my opinion, leaders to develop. And I don't mean the pyramid structure of leadership that we typically see with one person at the top. It's actually people taking leadership roles. And to me, when we talk about engagement, that is a huge factor in not just engagement, but also in retention of intellectual capital for an organization. Any comments on that, Sarah?
Yeah, no, it's a very significant point. And I think this is something that emerged from Edison's own experience with collaboration, and that's part of Phase 3 coherence, which is the shoulder-to-shoulder leadership idea. And for those of you who have gotten further in Midnight Lunch, you may have read about that. But it's a very significant part of how to create an agile workforce. Individuals learn leadership capacities at an earlier position in their work experience through these collaborative environments than they might have otherwise. And I think this is how we need to think about some of the impact of workspaces today. As you say, they generate leaders more readily and more rapidly. And it's kind of a quiet process. It sort of happens in the background. And I think it's something we need to call forward as an area of development that is really taking place in some of these workspaces and in some of how we design our teams. So I'm really glad you raised that, because I think leadership is a huge issue in collaboration. A quick comment from Francine, who is also on the call, a comment about Pixar and how Pixar designed their workspaces to encourage people to come together and congregate in playful settings. That's absolutely true. And as a company that creates movies, particularly animated movies that are often rated G and need to appeal to a very broad audience, the sense of playfulness that they want to translate into their movies, they built into their work environment. I talk about Steve Jobs and some of his impact on Pixar and its workspaces in Midnight Lunch. I can't remember right at this moment where that is, but you could actually look that up in the index. It's a very important point that you raised, Francine, about playfulness. And I think that's kind of where the Midnight Lunch part comes in a bit, the sense of playfulness in the workspace and allowing that. Edison sometimes would walk through the lab smoking cigars and telling jokes. So he loved the playfulness. But it's important to build that in, because we don't often think of it as a part of our thinking styles within collaboration. So a very crucial aspect that you mentioned there.
And Sarah, I'd just like to add one thing. Robin Wright, the British author, his book, Never Mind the Bosses, which is, by the way, a great book as well, he talks about authenticity, and this the playfulness plays into authenticity in the workplace, and authenticity and communication around between each other.
Well, that's an excellent point, and I hadn't really thought about that, but it certainly translates to communication. I talked about the sharing of private information, the things that you know most about, and become willing to share. That is also a translation of this sense of connection, and playfulness is a big part of that. And authenticity is huge. I know we're running a bit over time here. I want to just, if I can, just the last couple of minutes, make a quick comment. Terry was talking about a large organization in Canada, in Toronto, where they were offering this concept of hoteling, which we've read a bit about in the business press, so that they can go through the workplace and reserve particular places to work. So kind of not having just a cubicle as their place of quiet, but kind of signing up for a space within the organization so that they'd have access to different resources. That is a great trend to call forward, this notion of hoteling, and I appreciate you raising that, Terry. And Mike, I think what we might be able to do in our next webinar next week is allow some folks to try to come on the phone line. We'll see if we can do that. I know right now we've got everyone muted, but we might be able to take the next step and actually hear from individuals who are on their phones and offering us some of this input. So maybe
yeah, I would very much like to do that, and that would be very authentic from our point of view.
Yeah, no, that would be great, and we'll see if we can get the technology to work for that. We've had some technology gremlins here last week, so we're having good success this week, and I hope we'll continue with that into next week. But I want to also just make one last point here, and then I'll flash up the slide where we've got some information that you can use for the sign-ups for next week. Part of what's happening now, Christine makes the point that organizations are flattening, and we don't see the hierarchies and that common pyramid structure of organizations being as powerful as it once was, because there's so much horizontal movement of information via the internet and other virtual structures. The physical environment has to also respond to that. The way that communication happens in companies needs to shift, and this is what Christine is calling out as far as workplace design. So there are ways of looking at how the sales process operates, how even lunchrooms look, so that people can actually bond more fully in other parts of the workspace. And I'd love to get into this, Christine, in more depth, even more depth next week, if we could, when we talk about context and what happens when people have this shared context of understanding how they're dialoguing, what it is that they're thinking about, how those conversations are happening, and what the workplace actually does to encourage that. So for many of you are already signed up for next week's webinar on the 19th at noon Eastern Time. If you haven't yet signed up for it, here's the link. And I encourage you as well to share this link with others that you may know, whether they're within AWE or perhaps within your work group, perhaps people who are colleagues. Just see if they can head over to the AWE link and become part of our conversation.
Actually, Sarah, I'd just like to add something. And first of all, I'd like to thank you, by the way, before we sign off. That was fantastic. We're going to continue the conversation over in AWE. I'm actually going to be posting something to AWE, and you can add your comments and insight to the webinar on the actual site itself. So go over there and check it out, and we will look forward to seeing everybody, or speaking with everybody, actually, next week.
Wonderful. I so look forward to it, Mike. And thanks to all of you who were on the webinar today. Have a great week, everyone.
Take care.